Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be my review for the Acolyte Episode 7, which is called Choice. So as expected, this was our full flashback episode, a follow-up basically to Episode 3, but this time with the more or less full truth of what actually happened. It's an interesting episode because there are things I think to criticize about it and maybe the structure of the show given what they did or didn't do. I think broadly speaking I like it because there was a lot of character choices, you know, the name of the episode going on, that I think added nuance to the situation, to where when we jump in for the start of episode 8, there's going to be a lot of, you know, reaction to this. There's still some things that need to be answered coming out of this, but we now know kind of a little bit more about what happened. I think the criticism probably is that for all of the build up to, like, this is going to be the truth, the reveals are finally going to come out here, there is a bit of a sense of what reveals? Like, because most of the details of what happens here mostly are just, well, here is the nuance of all these characters' decisions coming together to create this situation and highlight how we go from just having two groups on this planet to ending with a whole, basically all of one of these groups dead and in the situation that we are actually in. How did we get there? We finally now know that. But in terms of probably some of the bigger, broader questions, the episode maybe didn't have any giant, mega reveals. And are they hiding them for episode 8? Or is this all you actually had? And there's maybe a bit of a case of, did they set expectations too high? Is that on fans or is that on the show? Versus, you know, what we actually got here. I feel so far, just based on episode 7, that I kind of was expecting some more details to come out, maybe about the witch's backstory, or for them to say a little bit more about how the twins were created, though I think that they brought it up enough to where I feel we are going to come back to that and explain it in the next episode. Like, there's a partial explanation here, but it doesn't, like, I think, give you all of the full explanation, and so there's some weirdness there. But the big thing that I liked coming out of this is that I think a lot of people were maybe expecting, mainly because of, I think, maybe a lack of confidence in the showrunner, that because a lot of the talk about this show was that we're going to show like the bad side of the Jedi, that they were really going to go and heavy-handedly just vilify the Jedi. I don't think coming out of this, that's what they did really at all. They showed individual characters who are Jedi making very specific choices that led to other things happening when combined with bad choices on the part of some of the witch characters. And I would not say coming out of this that what happens here is a like indictment against the Jedi Order in its entirety. Or that I think even like any one particular character comes out of this looking like a potential villain, really. I think a lot of what happens here is sort of understandable, and it's just we get to a few heat of the moment situations, and then a spark is lit at the wrong time, and characters have to make choices on the fly, and this is what happens. And that's the point of it. That Soul has not done anything like villainous. That is just like, this is a disgrace that you did this. But for him as a character, and I suppose what he expects of himself, in a way, what most of the Jedi, the level they aspire to be, their kind of conduct during what happened here is maybe not up to that standard. And so that's kind of what we saw. We saw some kind of things where, like, in reflection, all these characters feel that they maybe acted dishonorably, not befitting of a Jedi, and so they kind of punish themselves more so than what your actual analysis of the situation necessarily is. But the real thing now in the aftermath of this is Soul is directly telling May. How does May feel now that she knows the full story? What's going to be the reaction there? I'm assuming Osha is either told by Keimer or because of the connection between the two, somehow also knows the backstory coming out of this. And how does she feel about this, given some of the things that she didn't know? But no, you come out of this episode and they haven't done anything. Like, I think some of the speculation was like, has Soul altered Osha's memories of the situation using the Force, because they were setting up the idea of Soul uses the Force on people's minds a lot or something like that. No, they don't seem to imply that that happens like at all. No, Osha wanted to join the Jedi, Soul wanted her as his Padawan, and a bunch of stuff happened and that ended up being the case. But the cover up at the end is probably maybe the biggest thing to maybe get into. But let's go through the episode and we can talk about the details, the pros and cons of this episode. So we open up and we go straight into flashback. It's 16 years ago, but it's much more focused on the Jedi, whereas the previous one was much more focused on, I think, we're in with the Coven, and it's like from May and Osha's perspective primarily. So we have the Jedi team here on the planet, and we basically get the idea of like, why are they here in the first place? Do they know about May and Osha? But no, it's not quite that. They're mainly here because of something special going on the planet. But straight away, we get the idea they're taking plant and soil samples from the planet Brendok. The work is boring, and Torben, who's the Padawan, of course, of Indara, he is homesick, basically. He is really tired of how long they've been doing this and how boring this work really is. He says they've been here for 7 weeks and basically haven't really found anything significant. Indara tries to point out that, you know, the reason they're here is because this planet was categorized as being lifeless 100 years ago after a hyperspace disaster. Now, what they're talking about here is, again, this is a High Republic novel reference because the novels are 100 years ago. They are directly referring to the hyperspace disaster that is effectively the inciting incident of the story of the main High Republic novels, which is effectively it's a ship comes apart traveling through hyperspace, and the parts of this disaster fall out of hyperspace and basically litter across a pretty large amount of space and cause disasters on planets that it falls onto here. So the idea seems to be that the hyperspace disaster maybe made Brendok lifeless initially, but something has changed within the planet now in those 100 years, and so that's why the Jedi are here to investigate the sudden shift in the planet. Of course, this is also why I suppose we get the explanation for how this coven of witches has been in secret for all this time, is because they came to live on a planet that was regarded for all this time as being lifeless. So that's interesting. Torben wishes he knew that he basically wants to know that what I'm doing here for these 7 weeks, that it's important, that it's meaningful, that I'm actually doing something in a way kind of befitting of a Jedi. So you can see the arc they're sort of going for here straight away. We continue on with this because Soul sort of is the one to try and step up and be like, hey, try and see it from this perspective. This is what we're doing. This is an important mission. We are looking for a vergence, a concentration of force energy centered around a place. In this case, a vergence could theoretically create life on a planet like this, and something like that needs to be studied and protected if that is in fact the case. It's a noble mission. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. So straight away, we get some interesting world building here. A vergence. This is something Qui-Gon talked about in episode 1. Anakin apparently is a vergence in the Force. Notably, Mace Windu, I think when Qui-Gon says this to him, is just like, oh, a vergence centered around a person. So this is a vergence centered around a planet or place, which we've, I suppose, to a certain degree had before. Like, we've had these like nexuses of the Force. That's sort of what Mortis kind of is to a certain degree, but maybe the idea of a vergence is that it's like a sudden appearance of something like this rather than just a known nexus of the Force. But still, I think that's actually cool world building of what they're kind of trying to do here. That this is a thing that they can use in the future. That like Anakin isn't the only ever known virgins in the Force, because for it to be a known thing, it had to have been a thing before. That idea. But anyway, then we get Indara and Sol talking, and this is a quite interesting conversation because Indara tells Sol that Torben is too distracted to appreciate the significance of a virgins, and that they don't actually know for sure that the reason life is back on this planet is because of a virgins. Sol says that basically I sensed Torben was unbalanced and I felt I needed to say something like that to him, but Indara kind of counters and was just like, no, that was you were unbalanced and you tried to sort of like apply the way you felt to someone else. And she'll accuse this of him again, kind of coming up in a second. She says that she doesn't tell Torben answers to ease his mind. She teaches him to seek the answers for himself. Clearly Sol disagrees, because you see him, he's about to respond and he's like, but he doesn't say anything. And Indara's just like, this is why I have a Padawan and you don't. But I would take away from this a little bit of, does Indara handle Torben's kind of feelings about what's going on very well as his master? And I think the answer ultimately is no, given what happens. She's a little bit too maybe detached from how he's feeling, just kind of explaining it away as just like he's annoyed. When Sol, at the very least, is kind of like, no, he is a bit off because of this. He is getting very frustrated because of how long it's been, and he just doesn't feel it's particularly important. And so Sol, you kind of could argue, even though he's criticized by Indara here for this, helping him to maybe see it from a different perspective is a good thing. But Indara kind of shuts this down a little bit, because Indara maybe comes out of this like overall maybe feeling like, has she done anything too wrong? But you can maybe criticize like little bits and pieces of things like this, like, does she do a good job at kind of teaching her Padawan throughout this episode? And you kind of, I think, would say maybe not so. But anyway, then we kind of montage through things. I think some people are maybe over exaggerating how much recap this episode actually is, because I think it is important to kind of highlight, Sol watching a scene that we saw in episode 3, how much he does and sort of doesn't see, and the different characters, like what information they do and don't have. So we watch a few events kind of play out, just highlighting that, yeah, Sol scouted around after, like, spotting Osha and May. He saw some of the scenes we saw play out, and then sort of heads back to inform them that, he found them. That whole idea. So this is the idea of the Jedi, for the first time, discovered that there is people on the planet. And Sol is able to report back that basically it is a cult of Force witches. Don't know what the situation is. There's a bit of an argument about, like, are they Night Sisters or not? That whole thing. We know they're not Night Sisters, but, that you can see the comparison, of course. Sol immediately is worried about the girls because, especially because there is a ceremony happening tonight, basically. And so we have the team going to investigate the fortress. Kelnaka slices in, and the team, heads inside here. So, Sol mainly worries about the idea of, like, and this is maybe something you can criticize the Jedi for, of like, they are immediately suspicious of a group of other Force wielders. But at the same time, you would say the witches are just as feel the same way about the Jedi. And because there is the lingering sense of, they call it the thread, but effectively the thread is the Force. Are they using the dark side because their magic, in some of the cases here, does seem to resemble kind of dark side kind of magic, and you kind of see the issue that we're kind of developing here. But anyway, then we actually get, again, we cover a scene from episode 3, but from a different perspective. This time we see what actually happened in Torben's head when he was possessed. So we see Anastasia speaking to him while the conversation is going on, just prior to the obvious visual reveal that he's possessed. And she tries to manipulate him here, basically. Like, she plays on his fears, but more specifically his desires. Specifically the idea that he wants to go back to Coruscant. She says she can help him with that. She tries to kind of play him against his master. That is some of the dialogue here. It's just like, she won't let you. I can. That whole idea, you just have to ask me and I can kind of get you home. And just ask. And he basically does. He says, I want to go home. She demands he kneel. And he is possessed. And it seems to be this idea of, they do this, they speak to you, and if you in any way give in to them, they now have control over you. And so that is kind of part of what's going on here. But also notably, this is, I believe, the first time we see among the two groups someone actually like properly do something to the other side. And so in terms of the first kind of shot fired, to a certain degree it is this, even though I suppose you can criticize the Jedi for, you know, interfering in or around the witches, but, you know, there's that whole situation. Another conversation between Indara and Sol. Sol immediately is like, I feel a connection to Osha. Indara points out that the twins are too old to join the Order. He does feel that she is meant to be his Padawan, but Indara warns that the Coven will never let her leave. They are too insular, and they won't like let her go to outsiders. They then discuss the ceremonial markings, like why does May have one and Osha doesn't? And there's concern over the idea of clearly Osha is not super into what they're doing, and because of that they worry that like might something happen to Osha if they try to force her to maybe get one of these markings, or you know what happens when the ceremony full stop is complete in the first place. But she says to him, don't confuse what Osha wants with what you want. Now this is an interesting one because ultimately, as far as we're aware, Osha just wants to join the Jedi, and Sol has obviously made the connection here of he feels he is the one who should be her master if she joins. Now, obviously, he's particularly invested in her joining in a way because of this. But, you know, in a way, is... like, I don't get this obvious sense that, like, Sol is, like, manipulating Osha to further join the Order or anything like that. He obviously at times presents a very positive view of the Order, but broadly speaking, it seems like just from a free perspective, Osha does just want to join the Jedi. And I don't really feel they present an idea that, like, he has manipulated her to make this decision, like, in any way. So there's a little bit of like, what are you really saying when you say that? It's maybe just he wants it too much, like, what will he do to kind of get it type thing. But we'll see what happens. So then we get around to, again, stuff we've seen before. This time we do get to see May take the test. We see her purposefully get it wrong, but she makes it obvious because she answers before one of the pictures even shows up on the screen. And so they're aware of this. But they're like, okay, you clearly don't want this. But question, what is the Ascension ceremony? What's going on with that and your mark? She says that the Ascension means Osha and her will lead the Coven. And that is why she has a marking. They ask, like, well, wait, what? How does that work? How do you become the leaders after this point? And Osha's just, sorry, May is just like, I don't know. And that's a bit of a red flag. It's the idea that May has agreed to this big ceremony thing without really knowing what it actually means, which makes you lean in the direction of like Osha and the fact that she was concerned about it, of like, yeah, I don't actually know fundamentally what it is to be a witch, and I actually feel I don't want it. Being a Jedi is something that actually interests me a little bit more. That's more open than just kind of going along with it because this is what her, you know, family is kind of telling her to do. And it's an interesting kind of idea here when it comes to, like, you know, the witches are critical of the institution that is the Jedi here, but you can be equally as critical of the institution that is this particular coven of witches that have a specific group of rituals, specific ideology that makes up, you know, what the coven is. That, you know, they say they're a family, but it's still a group of a large amount of people that all are here because they feel the same way, they follow the same kind of Force type thing. It is the same situation, it's just that the Jedi are a bigger organization. So the nuance about this, I think, is pretty interesting overall. Then we get a very interesting thing. May says that, okay, this is what she told us about the ceremony. She says, everyone must walk through fear. Everyone must be sacrificed to fulfill their destiny. And Indara and Sol kind of look at each other like, that is ominous. But what's so interesting about this scene is that if you go back to episode 3 and actually look at the quote of where this comes from, like what May is trying to quote that her mother said to her is actually this. She says, ascension is about walking through fear. And again, the second part she gets very wrong in terms of the presentation. It's about sacrificing a part of yourself, the power of many instead of the power of one. It's basically the idea of we group together and sort of like give a part of ourselves to the group so that we are like kind of truly together. It's about the power of many. That whole idea, which when you present it and, you know, paraphrase it as everyone must be sacrificed to fulfill their destiny, that presents the witch group as sounding terrible. That like, are they going to sacrifice the kids to make something kind of crazy happen, when that doesn't come across to me at all in what Anastasia says when it comes to this. So I ultimately don't think the Jedi maybe read into this too much. Maybe it informs some of why Sol is like so worried about like the safety of Osha in particular, but it's just, I think, an interesting one that they give you that kind of detail, the misquote, and it adds into the whole idea of very few characters make, like, you say, giant mistakes or just absolutely terrible decisions throughout this. It's a lot of little things like this, like a game of telephone, like a sentence being misconstrued, you know, not being fully aware of how someone else feels, or like mishandling a tense situation. That's what leads to the kind of craziness that ends up happening in everything here. Then we get to see Osha's test here. This is her truthful test, basically. She there's a bit of a weirdness here because they focus on Indara as this happens, and I would say from the visuals you almost get the idea of, does Osha get it wrong, but Indara knows that Sol basically said you got it right anyway. But she says planet, and then when you cut to the screen, and you can see it there in the screenshot, I think that is a planet, because they show the ring rotating around, and it looks to be just a ringed planet, and that's what they show. So, because Indara then criticizes Sol later for basically, like, you coached her through the test, and it's like, he didn't tell her what it was. So, what happened here? Was this more about, like, a statement on what he said to her just before they did the truthful test? That sort of idea, because there is the whole thing of, like, we have not really seen Osha's potential in the Force. Like, they've told her, we find out, we'll get to it, she is very Force sensitive, she has the same potential as her sister, but we really haven't seen her really use the Force to get across the idea that she actually is skilled. And then it links into the idea, like we learned in the last episode, that she failed as a Jedi potentially because she hasn't been able to tap into her full power for whatever reason. But anyway, Indara's going to wait for the council's instructions while they wait for the blood test for the girls to come back. When she does get the report, the council has said no, they can't sanction bringing the girls back or separating them from their coven. So that is the Jedi making the decision that, like, they're going to kind of go. And it's what will, from this point on, bring the conflict into play. And that's what happens in this scene. So Sol and Torben are worried. Indara says Sol coached Osha to pass the test. I'd like a little bit more on that. I'd like to know what people think about that one. Indara says, don't alter her destiny because, you know, you have formed an attachment to her. And again, it's like, okay, I get why you're saying that, but at the same time, it seems pretty simple. Like, Osha does want to join the Jedi. We know from episode 3, Osha has scenes one-on-one with her mother where she says this. There's no influence from the Jedi. She just says this to her mother. She wants to be a Jedi. and ultimately Anastasia agrees with that. Soul is up for it. I get the whole like attachment thing of almost the idea of like as a Jedi you're a little bit too into this, but is there really anything wrong yet? And this is where maybe episode 8 there is something else going on here. We have to wait and see. He argues that, I just want to do what's best for her. And I think that kind of is the case, because they don't obviously present some sort of like ulterior motive for this. Like, I don't get the impression Soul is obsessed with like, I need to get a Padawan and this is my one chance. It's just, for whatever reason, like, he sees Osha, sees the situation she's in, sees her interest, and is just like, yes, I think you would make a good Jedi, and does the sort of obvious expected thing of like portraying the Jedi well, because why would he portray it elsewhere? And the idea is, overall it's perfectly fine to portray the Jedi as being good, because overall they are. As much as they're trying to portray the nuance of the Jedi in this episode, they still don't come out of this looking as villains, basically, as we'll get into in terms of what actually happens here. This is very interesting though. Blood results are in. We get the M count here. So if you've watched Bad Batch, you know that this is sort of the way they're referring to midichlorian count, is just by calling it M count. It is very high for both girls. They are both very force sensitive. We get this interesting word brought up as symbionts. And Torben reads it out and says that their symbionts are the same, exactly the same. And it's not just that they're similar because they're twins, identical twins. No. Identical twins should still have different looking symbionts, even if they're broadly similar. But the idea is that they are absolutely identical. Now, obviously what they're trying to say here is this idea that they're sort of like, what determines effectively their individuality within, I guess, the Force, within their blood, should be unique for every single living individual. But with these two, it is the same. And they point out that effectively, the only way this is possible is if manipulation happened. It's not possible to just randomly have two beings that have the same. So someone must have manipulated this. And so the Jedi come to the conclusion kind of quickly of like, that must mean the twins were artificially created. And the speculation naturally comes out because they realize, okay, well, our theory up to now is that we've been dealing with a vergence on this planet. And what power is great enough to allow someone to potentially create beings with the Force, and that is using a vergence of power on a planet, tapping into a power dense enough to split one consciousness into two bodies. Now, this is just speculation. Indara just speculates that this is one way that this theoretically could happen. There's still a lot of questions even factoring that in, of like, one, even if they initially created one being, the fact that it was kind of, obviously like it was two women witches doing this, the whole weirdness of this, I created them. There's that. But then they then effectively cloned what they created in the first place. And it immediately brings up the idea of like, wait, what are we doing here? Like, are we doing cloning type stuff here? Of like, is this a... Because I think the speculation behind the scenes probably is that, did the witches just decide to do this on their own because they needed to create new members of their clan, and they were aware of the power inherent in this planet when they arrived, and so they just decided to do this? But that would suggest that they knew that using the Force to create life is a possibility, which is like, do they know about that? Did someone tell them a specific technique to try and make this happen? Is it a Sith behind the scenes who told them this to see what would happen using the power here on this planet, and to what aim? Because obviously we're clearly, what we're doing here is that this is meant to be to a certain degree a test run ahead of Anakin in some way. That this is the idea of, we haven't quite created the chosen one here, but we've managed to create beings who are powerful in the Force, and two of them, but they're the same. And this kind of that creating life is a big thing in the first place, but then we've effectively cloned, like created the whole power of two, of just like, what did they say, like born as one, like what's the chant? It's they always one but born as two type situation. That whole idea. What's going on with that? This clearly needs to be explained a little bit more, especially because we have that dynamic from earlier episodes, even the last one it was referenced in, of Osha is having like force visions, but May isn't, and what is the situation with that? Because that seems to highlight that they're connected, but we don't have evidence to suggest May is having similar visions. So fascinating stuff there. When this gets brought up, Torben then reacts and is like, this is how I get home. This is how we basically, in his mind, he's like, if we get the kids, are able to properly report on this, we will have to bring them back or report on this to the Jedi Council. So he takes off to do basically something rash on a speeder. Sol follows. The other Jedi take the ship. And this is the idea of something is about to go down. So in terms of on the Jedi side of things, Torben is the one who sort of initiates the confrontation to a certain degree. Otherwise, I think the idea was that, well, the council had told them no, but they hadn't agreed on what they were going to do with the new information in place. Because clearly they would have had to like highlight the idea of, these girls are special and there's some weird stuff going on here, so further investigation would have been required. But sprinting off to try and immediately do something is not the right approach. And obviously I'm guessing Torben to a certain degree was aware that it might have taken days, weeks for them to finally get the go-ahead to do anything. So he makes his decision here. So this is, I suppose, to a certain degree, this is the mistake Torben makes, is that this decision is what ultimately leads to a lot of other stuff happening. Now, there's a bunch of stuff with other characters that still has to happen to get us to that many people dead, but Torben on the Jedi side of things does initiate this confrontation. On the witch side of things, the confrontation is absolutely made happen by Coral. We see her basically inflame May's anger, emotions, and is like, hey, you want to do something to stop Osha from leaving? Do it. And use your anger. So Coral definitely is like, use the dark side of the Force. Use the dark side of the thread. I don't think there's any other way to interpret this than Coral, there's a dark side twist kind of going on here. And I don't know if that is highlighting that just inherently the witch's magic is just based in the dark side of the Force, or this is a Coral specific thing, because Anastasia is not involved here. But clearly Coral wants May angry when she confronts Osha to get her to do something extreme. And this is where, like you would say, because Sol is with Torben, Torben isn't necessarily guaranteed to start an incident. That it needs something on the other side of things to actually happen, and Coral feels like is the thing that makes that happen. So then we get the meeting between Anastasia and the Coven, and this was referenced in episode 3. She said after they have the big heart-to-heart of Osha is like, I do want to go to the Jedi. This is not just like a passing fancy. This is, I think, what I really want to do. And the idea is Anastasia, as a mother, accepts that this is something she truly wants, and so is going to bring that to the others. And yes, we get the typical expected conversation here. They all want to keep both kids there. They don't agree with the idea of letting her go to the Jedi, but Anastasia decides that even though she's the leader, she is also the girl's mother, and she is making this decision as their mother and allowing Osha's choice to be respected, and effectively Osha can go if that is what she wants. And it is, so Anastasia has made her mind up. But this is where we see this lack of communication among the witches, where because Coral is also partially, I guess, a leader, or at the very least Anastasia is like the spiritual leader, and Coral is allowed to lead in kind of military affairs, there is a breakdown of communication at this point where because Coral and Anastasia don't have like another conversation, we get effectively what is going to happen here. So then a bunch of other stuff happens, obviously. May destroys the console, locking the front entrance, trapping everyone in. Coral obviously prepares the witches for combat. She orders them all to get their weapons out, ready for something. And this is before they know the Jedi are here, because Sol and Torben only arrive at the walls like immediately after this. So this is just Coral being like, whenever we go about like potentially handing Osha over to them, like the next time we meet the Jedi, we will be ready for war. And it's like, why? Why are we jumping ahead on this when Anastasia has stressed no violence? This is a problem. So yeah, Sol and Torben climb the walls to get in, and Sol does warn Torben, don't let the witches get into your head again. Otherwise, this will go south, basically. So he gives him that warning. Off screen, we see Kalnaka is basically the third Jedi to enter the fortress. We just get a scene highlighting that Indara is like, I'll drop you off and I'll arrive last. That's the whole idea there. And yeah, there is one minor scene here. You know, Anastasia doesn't want violence, but Coral just, you know, gets them all to gather up their weapons, and she says she will die before she lets the Jedi take her children. And so there's this clear breakdown between the two mothers here, where it's like, you should probably talk about this before you go into this confrontation with the Jedi. And I get the idea is everything's happening at once. We don't really have time to have this discussion here, but they're on so opposite sides of things. You can kind of see that there's some issues here at play. So yeah, May lights the fire and it quickly rages out of control. This seems to impact the entire electric system because, as we'll learn over the course of this episode, there's no extra stuff with the fire. No, the fire does just take over the whole place. The explosions end up happening. May didn't intend to send the whole place up in flames, just as a bit of a distraction to sort of scare Osha potentially. But it gets into the electrical system. It obviously causes some sort of a power surge. The generator explodes, which we'll see in a couple of scenes' time. And it is actually that extreme. But that still isn't what kills the other witches, as we'll get to. So yeah, the big confrontation ends up happening here. Archers take aim as Sol and Torben talk to Anastasia and Coral. We get the question asked, where did the twins come from? How were they created? And once again, in the same way that Coral was like, the Jedi won't like it when if they learn how they were created. And Coral is like, to Anastasia, so if the Jedi's theory about this, that they used the virgins, that is this planet now blossoming with life, to create the twins, is that inherently something that the Jedi are like, no, that's crazy, we need to come after you for that? The issue probably is, what is the technique that sort of created them? Because if it's a dark side technique taught to them by a Sith Lord, that obviously creates a problem. But if it was just them using their own magic, it's kind of like, okay. And there's a little bit of a like, okay, there's a further reveal about this that I think we still need. What's going to happen here? That's the whole idea. Then interestingly, Anastasia just says to the Jedi, your noble intentions at some point in the future are going to destroy all of the Jedi in the future. And is that like, have you sensed the future? Do you know that's going to happen? Or is this just one of those kind of ironic lines of, you know, you stick your nose where it doesn't belong, that is going to get you in trouble at some point into the future? Is that effectively what she's saying? You don't know. And then especially because theoretically, the speculation maybe is that like Coral and or Anastasia have potentially interacted with a Sith. Does that add to why they're so standoffish with the Jedi? We don't really know. But then it all kicks off. This is obviously what actually turns this into a proper incident, because up to this point it's like no one's died yet. Like there's issues, like the both sides have problems with each other, but no conflict has truly taken place. May rushes in and is like, fire, I need help. Sol calls to Osha, and this is where it's a little bit unclear about, like, does he think May is Osha, or is... Because he senses the fact that, like, May and Osha were talking from before. So I guess the idea is maybe Sol sees only May come out, and then it's like, wait, where is Osha if you have called only come in and you talked about a fire? Either way, that happens. So that's what his focus is on. Coral and Torben, this is where they take their battle stances, and this is where it all begins to go down. Anastasia turns herself into black mist and starts to do the same to May. I think the intent here is that she's just doing this to try and get them to safety. But I'm guessing the idea here is that Sol has no clue what on earth she is doing here. She's turning herself into a black mist, but she's turning May into a black mist, and it's not inherently clear that this is a safe technique. And so he reacts. He ignites his lightsaber and stabs her, kills her, just before she fully turns into mist. And the idea is that this stops May from being also turned into the mist and being taken away or something like that. But what we get here is that a dying Anastasia tells Sol that she was going to let Osha go because that was what Osha wanted. That, Osha chose you, Sol, and I was okay with that. We see May in tears, and obviously we get the idea. May was right there, and May saw Sol kill her mother. And that's one of the big reveals that we get. Coral tells her to run as more action takes place. So this is Sol's big thing. The reveal that Sol killed May and Osha's mother. And it was obviously in a reaction to Anastasia suddenly doing a crazy thread force technique right in front of him in a super tense situation. Again, this is where you also highlight the fact that the archers are up around on the walls and stuff like that. That doesn't help things either, because this fight was seconds away from kicking off as well. So, how differently would this have gone if Coral hadn't ordered all of the witches on, like, battle alert, basically? But then, how well would Sol have been able to keep Torben in check, given how intently he was on everything that he was doing? But then you also wonder, to a certain degree with Torben, how much of his desire to kind of go home has potentially been inflamed by the fact that Anastasia got into his head. Because we basically know that, like, Torben and Kalnaka, who are the ones who are going to get brainwashed effectively, seem to deal with the after effects of this for, like, their entire lives. Like, Kalnaka is scribbling witch symbols on his hut for, like, years upon years. And we know how Torben deals with this as we go forward. So, Anastasia, did she inadvertently push Torben to this kind of level? Who knows? Either way, the idea is Torben had those feelings, and this is what actually happens here. Fight begins. Torben, really actually cool combat here, defends against the archers very well, with some nice twirling of his lightsaber. Coral attacks Sol. He defends hand to hand and basically refuses to strike back. This is where the explosions go off, highlighting that no one did anything further to, I think, sabotage anything. It just happened as the fire spread. Sol does destroy Coral's weapon, but that's all. And he wants to go help the twins. This is where Coral turns into a black mist and disappears. And outside of what she says, like, a few seconds later, we don't see her again. So the implication is that Coral survives, and we probably would be expecting to see her in the next episode. So yeah, Torben knows what's happening here with someone turning into black mist, and this is that someone is about to be possessed. Coral says they should not have brought him here. Torben says his mind is fortified, and it's true. But she's talking about Kalnaka, who appears in the shadows, and so he has been possessed by the rest of the witches. So basically everyone except Anastasia, who's dead, of course, at this point, and Coral. So everyone else has taken control of Kalnaka, and are using him to fight the Jedi here. So this is where we get a cool duel here. Sol and Torben against the Wookiee Jedi Kelnaka. And I like this. The choreography is not as incredible or fancy as it was in the fight where Keimer was involved. But what I like is that it gets across the style of the Wookiee, where it's a Wookiee who has, of course, the strength of a Wookiee in his blows, but has a certain amount of the sort of flow and form expected of a Jedi lightsaber technique. And so you really get the idea of these kind of quick attacks, but because they come from a Wookiee, there's so much behind them. And so even a powerful Jedi like Sol has to struggle to defend against like almost like any basic lightsaber strike here. And, you know, Torben, inexperienced Padawan, does reasonably well, but is overpowered completely. Sol barely manages to save Torben's life. This is where Torben's face gets injured. Sol does manage to disarm Kelnaka by kind of, you know, striking his arm, getting rid of the lightsaber. But then hand-to-hand with a Wookiee is never going to go too well, even for a hand-to-hand combatant as skilled as Sol. So Sol is about to be taken out by Kelnaka, and this is where Indara arrives and basically just full-on charges into him, kind of knocks him over, and immediately tries to reverse the possession. And this is where we get the death of the witches. She basically, I guess, uses the Force to go into Kelnaka's head to fight against the possession. And it's really unclear if she does anything very specific herself. I think all she basically does from a thread perspective is, I'm guessing, she snaps the thread that's going into Kelnaka to free him. And in snapping this thread, it seemingly instantaneously kills all of the witches who were making this happen in the first place. It's unclear if they immediately die or if they just are knocked out and then maybe the fire kills them after that. But I'm pretty sure in the previous episode when Sol walks through the room, they're just all dead like this, and it's not obviously clear that anything else happened. I do think this is one of these things where it's just like Indara does the right thing, and it's just the fact of this crazy technique that the witches did put their lives in danger, and the Jedi reversed it, and this is what happens. There was no intent, I think, to kill all of them here. It just happened. So I don't think you can blame Indara for what happened here, but this is the fact of what actually happened. So, yes, Sol is then ordered to get the twins. So that's interesting from Indara, like just making the decision that will effectively get her perspective on this is, look at what has happened already. This is kind of, we have to take this to its completion of like, their family is now gone. We kind of have to take them now is the idea. But then there is a truth about this scene. It didn't happen exactly as it comes across. Sol was using the Force to keep both platforms up, but struggling. He then had to choose. It was either both of them were going to fall, everyone was going to go down together. He makes his decision. He tries to keep up Osha's platform and manages to save her, meaning May falls. So it went from being a thing where like the timing of when he arrived in episode 3 felt like this was the only option he really had, to no, he made more of a directed decision here. Now obviously he was in a tough situation. He had just been in a fight, injured, beaten up a little bit, not as strong as he maybe could have been. At full power, maybe there's the idea he probably would have been able to save both of them, but this is the complexities of the situation. And again, this is a huge thing, and obviously for Sol, he would blame himself for this. I think, I'm guessing May and or Osha are both going to maybe have issues with how he handled this scene, but I think objectively it's like, what was he meant to do? He can't do more than what he was able to kind of really do here. So like what more did you expect? He had to make a choice here. And obviously the idea here is that why did he choose one over the other? And the idea is he chose the one he was attached to a certain degree, I suppose is what we're trying to go for here. He chose the one that wasn't a witch, didn't want to be a witch. He chose the one that wanted to be the Jedi. And the fact that this decision to save lives was based on that might be kind of part of the problem here. But also there's maybe the sense of like, well, who started the fire? Which one of them is more good is the idea. And the decision making he went through to make this is an interesting one. But again, in the heat of the moment, like, he had to make a choice. It was either two girls die or one dies, and he made his choice. And can you overly criticize him for it? That's the issue, and that's the complexities that I like that come out of this episode. Because Soul's going to beat himself up for this. A lot of characters might beat him up for it, but is it evil? No, not at all. On the ship on the way home, Torvin apologizes. Indara warned the two of them not to interfere. Soul said he had to make a choice. Indara and Soul nearly come to blows over this. And then this is where they decide they're going to tell the truth, but actually it's this lie that, okay, may set the fire, but they're basically going to use this as the excuse of the fire ended up being huge, that killed everyone will believe that. Soul actually wants to tell the truth immediately, but Indara is like, hey, after everything that's happened, you really want to basically, leave her, Osha, in a situation where she has lost her entire family, and now she will also lose her dream, which is basically to be your Jedi Padawan. If you tell the truth, that will not happen, and you will have taken everything from her. And Indara is kind of pointing out, something good has to come out of this, and the connection between you two kind of is that thing. Give her this dream to be a Jedi, and not have it be burdened by like the messy truth of what happened here. That's the choice that she ends up making, and he kind of is forced to agree. And then the question does come up a little bit, here Soul needs to ask himself why he made this choice that he actually did. That's an interesting one. Will that actually come out? Osha then wakes up, and the idea is that Soul is now reluctantly realizes he has to tell her the lie. That when she wakes up and wonders what has happened, yes, he has to just be like, your sister did it, but you will be my Padawan, and we go from here. And so that is where it ends. We don't go back into the present day story. We leave it there. And the I suppose potential issue for the show is that now everything is on the final episode. There is so much pressure on this final episode to deliver, because there's still a lot of moving around that needs to happen. We basically know the finale is going to take place, I think, on Brendok. So we have to get there first, and yes, I guess Soul is on his way there. I think we know from the trailers, I think May escapes in a smaller craft, and they both end up there. Kymer has to get there, Osha has to get there. Theoretically, we also have to introduce our second Sith Lord, because I think we know we are going to get the introduction of another Sith character. So that has to play a role as well. And we have to have all this character stuff happen. There has to be, I suppose, May is directly hearing the story, so we'll get her reaction immediately. The question's going to be, how does Osha hear about the story? Will we explain that by Kymer having told her, or in the mask has she heard the story because it's like Force, like deprivation except for the Force? And how will Osha react? Because that's probably the big thing here, is when Osha finds out the truth that Soul killed her mother, and that Soul chose her effectively over her sister, and then has kind of lied about that. That's the other part of this, the long-term lying to someone so close. How will Osha react to that? And it's the idea of she's being tempted by a Sith Lord here, who is being very truthful with her, and now she's just found out that her Jedi Master is lying to her. How will that go down? Because I think we're expecting a kind of explosion of dark side from Osha at some point, and that if someone is going to kill Soul, I've said it for a while now, it probably is going to be Osha's big turn to the dark side. But then where does that leave May as a character? And is there time in the final episode to do all of this? Because I'm guessing we probably will get a season 2. But what they need to do at the end of this season is highlight the idea. Here's the actual lineage of the Sith. Here's another Sith Lord. But the second you do that, it feels like you need to... Saul has to die. So, meaning the only main characters who can really survive are of course, May and Osha. Khmer, it depends on what they're going to do with him. Is he the Sith apprentice and his master, and they actually still have a relationship, but he's trying to make his apprentice in secret? Is he a failed Sith apprentice, and there actually is another master and apprentice out there? Basically, the idea of, to a certain degree, like, is he meant to be like Darth Tenebrous, Darth Plagueis? Is Khmer meant to be Darth Tenebrous, Darth Plagueis? Or is he meant to be Darth Venomous? As in, like, the extra one who isn't actually going to be part of the proper lineage? What are we doing there? And then there are truths about other stuff that needs to happen. Like, that, it feels like there's a few questions still about the events that happened there that need to come out. Of, like, one, is Coral alive? And if she is, she clearly knows the truth about what happened in regards to the creation of the girls. And I'm guessing the Sith have to be involved. This is why Khmer knows both of them and has his focus on them, because he knows their high potential and they were potentially created by dark side use of the Force, magic, whatever. And that's why this is all the case. Do I think Coral is a Sith? No. I do think she is just a witch who has kind of been maybe manipulated in all of this and used by the Sith. I'm not sure that would be a good choice to have her be revealed to be a Sith Lord or anything like that. And I think from the fighting, I don't think she comes across as powerful enough maybe to be that way, unless she is hiding everything about herself. So that needs to happen as well. There's still Vernestra and team, who I think they have to appear on the scene. And there's still the theory from last episode that who is Khmer's old Jedi Master? Is it Vernestra? Is that confrontation going to happen? And how many more characters are going to die in all of this? And then what is the setup for a theoretical season 2? Because we're either leaving a lot of things wide open and we're not really going to be very, very, very much in resolution mode, or we're very rapid fire, just going to be boom, boom, boom through everything. And I'm excited, but also kind of terrified for the last episode, because, you know, the whole season is ultimately still going to, you know, really hinge upon what they do or don't do in the final episode. Because this episode, while good, and I've talked about the nuance throughout it, I do still think it is missing maybe some of the giant reveals. For a lot of people, I think their expectations were that there was going to be some earth-shattering reveals. And there isn't really in this episode, but there's still the potential for the show to have them. It's just waiting until the last episode is always a bit of a frustrating thing when you have a show that I think maybe hasn't been paced out the best, because will be discussions about, now that we have this, did we need to do episode 3? Should we not just have maybe waited and done one very long flashback episode that just includes the full truth, and we could have just had episode 1, 2, 4, 5, 6 be a group, maybe those episodes fleshed out a little bit more, maybe something else happening in the middle, one flashback episode, and then the finale. Because I think what happened here, like basing a lot of this around what has happened here, that the story starts off and hinges upon May wanting revenge for what happened because she saw Soul kill her master, her mother, and then blames it on all of these Jedi for their involvement kind of in this. That's where this came from, remember? And the whole idea of, kill a Jedi unarmed, basically, and the idea of, that being it. Soul killed Anastasia while she was unarmed. Is it the same thing, though? Because based on what actually happened, like, she was using a Force technique that is unusual and looks dark-sidey right next to him. And it's the idea of, like, if you kill someone shooting Force lightning at you, are you killing them unarmed when they were using an offensive technique that just is not holding a weapon, but they were like using the Force as a weapon type thing. And that's the details we're talking about here. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on episode 7. How did you like the reveals? What actually went down here? What are your thoughts on the format of the show? Like, did they need to do multiple flashback episodes? Did they build to this too much, given what actually was here? And then, what do you think is possible? What's on the board for next episode in terms of what the reveals are or won't be? And where are you at with the series with 1 week to go? But yes, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.